Takes a lot to build things, and then when we do, we don't build them efficiently, and we don't build them cheaply. 1 mile of subway in New York, you could get a whole province worth of rail in China for that amount. We've spent billions, double the amount of billions, to not even get a little bit of high-speed rail in California, and every single building proposal, no matter how heralded it is as transformative of the economy, is so larded up with delays and requirements that it's more than frustrating. There's a whole theory of the case that it's really impinging on the Democrats and America's agenda. One person who I have been reading lately who says this is an interesting voice in all of this. He's Harry Holzer. He was the Department of Labor economics chairman during the Clinton administration. He's now a public policy professor at Georgetown. He's written about this for The Hill. Hello, Harry. Welcome to The Gist.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be here.
So we could start with, and I gave a little bit, and if anyone's been hearing any of the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson book tour, there are all these examples of how long things take. And even when there's an infrastructure bill passed, it takes 1.5 years to not even get it done. So I'm going to assume that many in my audience know these examples. But my first question to you is, as someone who is inside the federal bureaucracy, and also as someone who's dedicated his life to using the power of the government to correct problems, for how long have you been aware that this isn't just a bit of a frustration, but it is a real crisis?
It's interesting. It's not something that a lot of us focused on for a long time. I'm a labor economist, so I mostly focus on wages and employment and worker skills and how to improve them. And we can come back to that later. But several important writers, Rui Teixeira at the American Enterprise Institute, of course, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, among others, Yoni Applebaum, have really brought this to our attention over the last 2 or 3 years. And frankly, Kamala Harris's defeat in 2024, which has led to some long overdue soul searching among Americans, and several problems contributed to that. But the difficulty of building and people's frustration with the terribly high cost of housing. And, as a Democrat, since I'm marked with a big D on my forehead from my time in the Clinton years, the fact that population is flowing quite steadily and even quite rapidly out of all the major blue states and cities, San Francisco, LA, New York, Chicago, and where are they going? People are going to Arizona and Texas and Florida, where housing is much cheaper, taxes are lower, et cetera. That's a real wake-up call to the Democrats if they want to win elections in the future. So
yeah, this is what an economist might call a revealed preference.
That's right. In the end, the markets do work. But a lot of us just weren't as focused on this as we should have been for a long time.
Right. And I assume it's for a few reasons. One is that some amount of regulation are not only necessary, but in fact, were probably some of your life work. I wonder, I don't know how much direct input you had, but when you were with the Clinton administration, you were probably advocating for certain policies which amount to regulation, which might now be the sort of regulation we point to and say, well, that's what's slowing things down. Was that the case? I mean, you couldn't have gotten everything perfect.
Yes, since I'm a labor guy, the regs that I was most involved in was attempts to very moderately raise the federal minimum wage, to make sure that pensions are safe, things like that, which again, if they're done in moderate amounts, create good things, or at least the positives to the economy outweigh the negatives. And that's still true, and in a world where climate change is a real thing, it's not a hoax. And yes. I think we will need good regulation going forward, of course, not just in the United States, but all around the world. So I don't want this to be viewed as an anti-regulation. But in some areas, most clearly housing, the rules have just piled up. And I think that's one of the problems, is that we seem to add new regulations all the time, and we're not as good as eliminating the old ones that are maybe less justified.
Yes.
And so you have this, it's not like any specific regulation necessarily tipped us from positive to negative. It's this general increase without doing enough to take away the ones that are less timely.
Because there is not an easy mechanism for that, but also because there are constituencies that want those regulations, because it marks you, especially if you're in a place where you can lose to Republicans. That's a very Republican, right-coded thing to be anti-regulation. And you add that all up, and there's this huge disincentive to ever change unless you get what just happened, which is the wake-up call of a lost election.
That's right. Now, and of course, on the housing thing, this is very clear. If you are an owner of an existing property or housing, your housing values and therefore your wealth are probably higher because of all these regs. So there is a conflict between the interests of the current homeowners versus people who need to own, but who are squeezed out by these terribly high costs.
Yeah, that's true. But as a homeowner, there are maybe I'm using the term wrong, but there's a lot of exogenous inefficiencies, and there's a lot of costs. The homeless
absolutely.
crisis affects homeowners, affects, if you just want to be talking about like rational economic actors, affects the prices of homeowners. And this is because of bad labor, bad housing policy.
And even those of us who benefit from high housing values, and I'm certainly in that category, what about our kids and our grandkids and their ability to buy housing anywhere nearby is severely curtailed by these problems.
Right. Or to get back to politics, what about the next generation to ever put their faith in Democrats and therefore maybe have the other parts of the Democratic agenda that might be helpful? And you mentioned climate change.
Exactly.
I do wonder if I had an environmental expert on who probably would agree with that op-ed of yours I read in The Hill. They might say something like, well, the environmental regulations, those we need. But let's talk about maybe they'd say housing regulations. If I had a housing person on, he might say, well, the housing regulations, you have to understand, we can't have sprawl. But some of these labor regulations are what's causing the process to be so slow. So I went on the Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy. I know you went to Harvard. I don't know if you have many academic affiliations. I don't know if that's one. But they write that the passage of what was then a once-in-a-generation slate of industrial policy bills gives state and local recipients an historic opportunity to enable worker power building, strategies that can be leveraged to empower workers who work on, they list a couple of the bills, IRA chips, include project labor agreements, prevailing wage agreements, labor peace agreements, local and targeted hiring authorities, workforce developments and apprenticeship, place-based energy community tax credits, domestic content requirements, child care provisions, a scoring system for competitive discretionary grants and loans that incentivizes the use of community benefit plans that encourage fair and fair choice to a union. There are trade-offs in economics. So I don't know, maybe a lot of those are a wish list, but aren't a lot of those also exactly contributing to the problem you diagnose?
I think they did. I mean, again, I have sympathy to the general notion that we need to help workers earn higher wages and improve their skills and even have more power in the workplace.
Yeah.
And there's
Let me
different ways
interrupt
to
and
do
say, so the audience knows, you don't just have sympathy. Like much of your life work has gone towards that end, right?
That's right. But at the same time, like if we were talking about the minimum wage right now, I would say these are the positives of minimum wages, especially when they go up to $15, $20 an hour. But these are some of the negatives. How do you balance those out and get to sort of an optimal place? And the long list that you read is instrumental because, again, if you take any of those in isolation, they might not be a bad thing. It's that 10 or 12 items plus Buy American rules. It likely slowed down the progress on those three big bills. And by the way, I supported those bills wholeheartedly. But the tragedy is that by election year 2024, the Biden administration had actually fairly little to point to of things completed. One of the big numbers that you see a lot in the press is that they only completed 58 electric vehicles charging stations, which is shocking. You throw that many billions of dollars at something, you should end up with more than 58 stations after the 2 or 3 years they had. So again, I think that was the problem. It was overkill. And even without any of that stuff, it would have been hard to do this fairly quickly. You know, you look at the Boston Big Dig a few decades ago and other things. And there's a guy at Brookings named DJ Gribben who writes about this a lot and all the tension between federal rules and state and local rules and jurisdictions. So it would have been challenging anyway. But to take a challenging situation and add that much, so many extra regs, so much extra paperwork, it couldn't have helped. I can't say how much it hurt, but it certainly didn't help. And that's a whole different problem from the housing issue, which is mostly a state and local issue rather than federal.
Yeah, and the thing with the Big Dig is it did cost a lot, and there were so many stories about it. But, you know, today I was just talking to someone in Rhode Island, and they were like, you know, I could get to Logan Airport in less than an hour. And that's because of the Big Dig. So I don't know if that person will say the words I just said, and that's because of the Big Dig, but it is. And someone could make that point. And I don't know we'll ever get that statement with the charging stations. I don't know that in 10 years we'll ever have thousands of charging stations that work for whatever generation of EV vehicle is in operation then.
Well, we probably won't, simply because I imagine the Trump folks are going to try to kill off, you know, certainly on the green energy part of this. If that hadn't happened, if Kamala Harris had won or some other Democrat and this had been preserved, you know, you would have seen this very, very slow progress over time. 20 years from now, people might look, and again, I supported all three bills. I think you can make a strong case for why all of them are necessary and will provide benefits. It's just that we've made it too hard and too slow to make great progress on them.
So how can progress be made on this issue? Is it a question of the people who get elected empowering their bureaucrats, maybe their labor economists in their departments, to prioritize not just the wish list of people we want to help, but something like efficiency and prioritization? Is that possible?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think the first thing that has to happen is Democrats have to embrace this idea that this part of the abundance agenda, that this really matters and it affects their appeal. And then if and when they get elected, they have to figure out, and again, it's hard for me as an outsider to know exactly what changes in the regs, but to prioritize a process for rethinking, preserving the regs that really do make sense, but trying to slim down those that may be dated or just add too many costs. And you know, and I think as we talk about how bad this is, we got to talk about, you know, the near miracle that Josh Shapiro pulled off in Pennsylvania. You know, when the I-95 highway, a chunk of it was destroyed, and he replaced it in a stunningly quick amount of time. Now, he declared an emergency, and he still used unionized labor. But it just shows that if you prioritize this, it can happen. And he had a real emergency. He did have an emergency. So it was easy for him to invoke under that emergency ruling changes that otherwise might not be politically possible. But at least under some circumstances, it can be done. So what can we learn from the Josh Shapiro example and others where not only which were successful, but achieved with modest time and modest cost?
Yeah, from what I understand, there were two crews right next to that section of highway, and his transportation, the Pennsylvania State Transportation Authority, the executive went in and said, all right, you're going to work here, and you're going to work there. And that was the same day they were working on the Big Dig. And they didn't involve a scoring system for competitive discretionary grants and loans that incentivize the use of community benefit plans, right?
No, that's right.
You can't have both.
That's right. That's right. And again,
but
most
the other
of the
thing
time,
is in an emergency, when a section of highway essentially blows up, maybe that's one thing and you'll relax it. But isn't there this infrastructure okay, maybe that's the wrong term, but isn't this established? I'm not going to say deep state stakeholders who just will not give up this idea that the only way to get the climate justice they want, the labor justice they want, is to go through these very procedures. Because if not, you're selling out important stakeholders. And especially for Democrats, they're very sensitive to that.
No, that's right. And you know, one of the disadvantages that Democrats have relative to Republicans is that the Democratic constituency is much more diverse. And I don't mean just racial or gender diversity. I'm talking about diverse stakeholders and interests. And each one cares about one dimension of this problem a great deal, whether it's environment or racial justice, labor standards. But there are times when, and I look back to some of the successes of the Clinton years and to some extent the Obama years where they were able to prioritize, and not everybody liked it. But in the end, those two presidents were able to convince people this is really necessary if we want to have a successful party in the future. We will try to preserve the things that matter to you most. So when I was in the Clinton administration, it was pretty soon after NAFTA was passed, and organized labor was not happy about that. And yet I think the Clinton folks reached out to them, tried to accommodate their interests as best they could, and make clear to them, we're not forgetting your needs, but in this case, we had to prioritize economic development and economic growth. So it's hard, but a strong leader with some charisma, with good communication skills, I think could make it happen. And again, it's also got to happen at the state and local level, not just federal, because that's where the housing, the regs that choke off housing, or that's where most of them are worst.
From your perspective as a one-time insider to the Clinton administration, which did prioritize economic growth as per your testimony here, and your observer as an academic who was looking at the Biden proposals, which you supported, was there more of a adherence to the wishes of the groups? Was the Biden administration less likely to say what you just said the Clinton said to labor? Biden just wouldn't say, hey, listen, we all want what's best, but our priority now is growth.
Yes. The quick answer is yes, there was more of that under Biden. The Biden administration and even the economists in the Biden administration very explicitly were in some ways rejecting what a lot of people have called the neoliberalism of the Clinton and Obama years. And some people thought the economists had too much power in those administrations. And we did make some mistakes. When we let China and the World Trade Organization, we didn't correctly anticipate this massive flood of imports and how much damage it would do in that first decade to manufacturing industries, to community. We just weren't ready for that flood. And so we didn't pay enough attention to those costs and to prepare for them. But I think the Biden folks went in with this notion of we're going to empower workers. We're going to stand strong with environmentalists. We're going to stand strong with racial justice and equity warriors. We're not going to worry that much about what the economist said. I think they made a lot of explicit choice along those dimensions. And I think in the end, the costs of that approach, and of course, the biggest cost, if we pivot to some of these other issues, that first relief bill, nearly $2 trillion when the economy was already recovering. There's no question that was inflationary. People still argue about how much, and it contributed something. That was an example where, in some sense, it's almost the revenge of the neoliberals saying, hey, you know what? These market forces still matter a lot, and fiscal discipline. But yeah, I think the Biden folks, and I'm friends with virtually all of the economists. Some of them are outstanding economists, but I think they let the pendulum swing too far in the other direction.
Yeah, revenge of the neoliberals, Summers, Furman, Holzer. I don't know. You put yourself in the category?
Yeah.
Were you saying it then? What do you say? Inflation almost hits 10%. What percentage of that is government spending? 3 or 4?
No, probably less than that.
Okay.
Let's say inflation would have been 2 or 3 without any of this stuff.
Yes.
And then it bumped up from, say, 3 to 9. And I still think the bigger factor was probably what economists call the supply shocks.
Oh, yeah.
The
global pandemic, there was a snarled supply chain.
Yeah, supply chains, and then the Ukraine war and all those things. My best guess is that Biden's bill alone, which came on top, of course, of all the Trump spending bills, and people had already accumulated a lot of cash. The Biden bill probably added a point or two, maybe closer to 2 points on getting to the 9. The problem is in the voters' perception, that's too nuanced a story for a lot of voters to understand. Demand shocks and supply shocks. What voters saw was we spent trillions more than we needed to. We got high inflation, and they assume that the former caused the latter. with some justification, but trying to argue that, well, it was only this much rather than this much, I think would not have been a very persuasive political argument at the end of the day.
In the Biden administration, is it the case, as you just said, that prior Democratic administrations listened to the economists more? Or is it the case that the Biden administration was just listening to different economists?
Probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
So I've spoken to a few of those economists, not all of them. The sense that I got was that they were frequently told, you stay in your lane and we will make the bigger decisions. I am told that they had actually very little input into the $1.9 trillion size of that first spending bill. Now, I'm guessing that Biden may have reached out a little more frequently to one or two of them to whom he was closest. But no, I know the economists were saying, and especially the mainstream economists, maybe more than neoliberals in the administration, you stay in your lane and we'll tell you what we want to hear from you. Thank you very much. And
because
some of the
mantra was, we learned our lesson from the financial crisis. And we know now that it's better to err on the side of too much than err on the side of too little. And my diagnosis is, and err on the side of too much. They did. When you go into anything with that mindset, you're going to err on the side of too much.
No, that's right. And some of the greatest mistakes made in history, mistakes that have caused some of the most serious wars, are when people overreact to the last mistake. And so this time they reacted at least as much. And I understand that argument that, when the spending bill was passed, it was in the early part of 2021. Unemployment was still about 6%. It had recovered quite a bit. It still had a way to go. And there was a fear that some of these new variants, the Delta variant, the Omicron variant, could tip us back into a recession. So some safety measure was appropriate, but the economy just didn't need $2 trillion worth of it. That was just overkill. And there are all these quotes. We need to be bold. We weren't bold in 2009. Now we need to be bold. Being bold is,
I have a quote
that's not
from,
enough of a policy.
I have a quote from Mike Consul, who was affiliated with the administration at some point, who literally said, what we need to not do is listen to Larry Summers. And I don't know if they teach that in economic textbooks, but they probably shouldn't. I don't know if there's a Summers curve.
I think there isn't a Summers curve, and Larry and I went to graduate school together. I was a few years behind him, almost 50 years ago. Larry doesn't call everything right. He called this one right. And I think it's better not to have rules like don't listen to Larry Summers. Listen to what Larry says and then try to take the most sensible aspects of it.
Now, you just used the word sensible, and this is the last thing I want to get at. Here's what I worry about. I think you're right. I think the diagnosis is right. I don't know that right people such as yourself and maybe Ezra Klein and Derek Thomas, people I see as reasonable, I don't know that is the way to actually make change happen. We are seeing now that a way to make change happen is with the proverbial, and in Musk's case, the literal chainsaw. Is there some history we could point to? Is there some reason to think that given the two choices, one, tear it all down and maybe we'll build something that makes sense in the future, which is essentially what they're doing now, and who knows if they even believe in making sense of something in the future, and the other one, hey, let's recognize our mistakes and let's reasonably reform and let's tweak around the edges. Is there a real chance that the tweak around the edges, reasonable people are going to be able to have massive reform on this?
Well, I think there's a reason for hope, and it's going to take some time, and it's not going to happen quickly anywhere. My view, again, is that both the Clinton and the Obama administrations, they made some economic mistakes, but a lot of good things happened. And of course, Obama had the Great Recession at his back, which enabled him to undertake a lot of things like healthcare reform and saving the auto industry that otherwise he might not have accomplished. But I do think, you mentioned Elon Musk and the chainsaw. That's going very badly, and it's going to end very badly. So we definitely don't want to follow that model. I think we want strong leadership. We want more examples like Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. I'm not saying it should be Governor Shapiro, just as an example. And you want strong leadership, but I think you can point to the reality and say this somehow has to change. And Democrats can't afford to not change. And then the question is, how do they do that in a sensible manner, in a way where they're still paying some attention to the traditional constituencies, the environmentalists and people who care about racial justice and worker power, because those things matter too. But the pendulum has to swing back a little bit in the direction of enabling us to build with greater efficiency and less failure. That just has to be a priority. And again, a strong leader can sell it politically, bring the constituents together. And I'm not saying it'll be easy, but boy, we have to make that a priority and start to walk down that road.
Harry J. Holzer is a professor of public policy at Georgetown, a fellow in economic studies at Brookings, and a former chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. Thank you so much.